I'm Tony Benn. This time I am interviewing Britain's top political interviewers.
Victoria, do we have McGuinness or not? Doesn't want to know.
Jon Snow began in commercial radio in 1973 and has presented Channel 4 News since 1989.
First, 7:30, our main headlines tonight.
1 million people watch him every night. What is the purpose of an interview? Is it to explain, to discuss, to explore, to hold to account, to argue?
It's all of those things. The interview is about extracting information, trying to find out what the thinking is, what lies behind whatever the decision has been, analytical, possibly at times exposing. Obviously one is looking for inconsistencies, for a degree of, is it quite what it seems to be? Now that may render us rather sceptical, even cynical, but I think primarily it is to get information, which is why personally I like to hear somebody answer before I chip in again. It's also about putting alternative views possibly that have been expressed by others and seeing how the interviewee responds to them.
If a Labour MP does that, he is often, by the media, described as a troublemaker. And I wondered whether using that definition of what a Labour MP does would make you a troublemaker. Would you see yourself in that capacity?
Am I a troublemaker?
Well, I mean, is the function of the interviewer to make trouble for those in power?
I think the function of journalism is to shine a light on what is going on. And if that causes trouble, well, so be it. And I'm a journalist, and that's my business.
Now, there are 7 million trade unionists in Britain, but the impression I get, I may be wrong, is that trade unionists only interviewed when there's a strike. Now, am I right in saying that trade unions don't really get their share of the public interest?
Well, hang on a minute. When you were a minister, trades union leaders were all powerful. They had a tremendous role in the industrial system. Today, even by their own admission, first of all, there's a huge section of the workforce which isn't unionised. And secondly, the beer and sandwiches, the whole business of engagement in present political issues and the rest of it is much lower. So why interview somebody who isn't particularly germane to this argument?
Take one other example of this. We just had local elections.
Yeah.
And at no stage throughout the whole of that debate that I noticed was anyone from a local authority invited to say what had happened to local government. In the old days, they built schools, they built houses, they ran services, and it's been a total transformation. But the whole discussion of the local elections was about whether Blair or Cameron would win, or Campbell would win. Now, am I wrong in supposing that there are whole areas of public interest that don't actually become newsworthy enough in your terms to lead to an interview?
You're imbuing me with an extraordinary power to determine and dictate who comes onto the television. I'm surely part of a process which is holding a mirror up to reality. And the mirror to reality is that local authorities are centrally funded. Their every jot and tittle in the end is really dictated by central government. You helped participate in a regime which over many, many years has centralised power to Whitehall. And when we have local elections, we know perfectly well that 80% of the money, 100% of the policies flow from the centre. What's the point of talking to the monkey when you've got the organ grinder in Whitehall to talk to first?
Well, that's a fair point, but wouldn't you have thought talking to a few, as you use the term monkeys, to find out the dilemma in which they found themselves? Of course, if they said to you what you just said, we've got no power, that would be tremendously important.
Wouldn't it? But they wouldn't, of course, because, of course, they live under the illusion that they do have a great deal of power.
Well, now let me come to another point. When you introduce somebody, do you introduce them factually or judgmentally? For example, I've heard people be interviewed here and everywhere else. We've got so-and-so, he is an expert on the Middle East, and we have somebody else who's a rebel. Now, if you hear a rebel speaking in terms of his reputation as a well-informed, a side-by-side, that is going to prejudge to some extent how people regard the validity of the arguments by the two sides. Is that a fair point?
I'm not sure that it is, because I'm not conscious of using the word rebel, for example. And it's an important word, because there are a lot of rebels, and it would obviously be apt to say, well, we're now going to Bob Marshall-Andrews, well-known Blairite, anti-Blairite or rebel or whatever. But I don't think we would do that. We might say who has questioned some of the Prime Minister's statements of late, something like that, which I suppose to some extent does prejudge, but it also gives the viewer important information. I mean, if you say, here's Bob Marshall-Andrews, Labour MP, does that really give a full picture of who he is? Because anybody in the know knows that Bob Marshall-Andrews is not a loyal Blairite and has questioned the Prime Minister's stance on a lot of things. And to that extent, you owe it to the viewer to flesh out a bit the question of, well, without prejudging. I mean, I'm not sure that he would object either.
I find that a number of words are quite neutral. For example, who are in the international community? It's often spoken of. Can you give me a list of countries in the international community as distinct from countries in the United Nations? It's quite an interesting distinction.
Well, now you're onto rocky territory, because since the death of the ideological struggle in which you played so formidable a part, we've had a tremendous difficulty describing who we are. Are we the West? Are we the international community? Are we a part of the international community? Are we the North? How do we describe ourselves? And it's a very difficult thing to describe. Or are we just the coalition of the willing? It's very difficult to have an epithet that describes a collection of, I know what's coming, like-minded nations that have some particular vision of the way policy should go in a way that is acceptable.
But I would have thought there was something to be said for using a word which had an immediate meaning to everybody, the United Nations. Now, would that be a fair point to make, rather than use the word international community?
No, I don't think it would, because you're imbuing them with some position, perhaps, that the United Nations has adopted on what you're about to discuss. And they may be at variance with that position, and therefore not want to be described as the United Nations.
I get the feeling that sometimes, when the time is too short, everybody is angry, the interviewer, the interviewee, and the public. And I wondered whether there was a case for arguing for a little bit more time.
Well, I'll say something which I know you'll disagree with. I believe if you can't say it in 30 seconds, it probably isn't worth saying. If you can't distill at least the key thought into 30 seconds and then lay yourself open to another question about it, then you've come up with something which is too complicated for people to concentrate on. Now, there's a dreadful thing to say.
Well, if you talk for 15 seconds, in some cases you get interrupted after 10, so don't be. Now,
I mean, I've always said that you can be too bright for television, too intelligent, that actually the medium has limits to it. One of the reasons why I think I've achieved in television is because I have a limited intellect, and therefore I tend only to ask reasonably simple questions, which the medium is at peace with.
I wonder whether the object of all interviews, and I'm talking about your profession rather than you personally, is to get at the truth or to disagree, and do interruptions help or hinder understanding? How do you see it?
I think there is a structural problem in conducting a television interview. There's a tremendous time constraint. First of all, you're unlikely to have more than about 3 minutes. 3 minutes is a very short time. It would be invidious to mention names, but there are people who, if you didn't interrupt at all, could fill the 3 minutes single-handed without a single question. I think, unfortunately, that interviewing is a game. The interview improves for the participation of the interviewee in the process. And the process involves short, concise answers to the question posed. And it seems to me that very often you ask a question to which you get an answer which has nothing whatever to do with the question. And that tends, in my book, to demand an interruption. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was at the Prime Minister's press conference one day, and I asked him how he would feel if Iraq had come to him and said, listen, we've found a wizard wheeze. We're going to have an upper house into which you'll be able to buy your way by loaning money to the Prime Minister of the day to win the next election. And far from answering the question, he came in with a sort of perfectly blithe answer, which had almost nothing whatever to do with the question I'd asked. Now, those are the circumstances under which I think you're compelled to interrupt. And in fact, I did.
Now, I suppose the question that is in the back of my mind is an interview a spectator sport with a winner and loser, or is it really an opportunity for people watching to hear both sides, if it develops into an argument, without well, without it being held back.
But we're not in the business of boring the pants off people. And it seems to me that it has to have some sort of uplifting element to it. I mean, something engaging. There's nothing more boring than saying, you know, Minister, what would you like to say? Equally, I don't think we're there for sort of common assault. You know, I think we have an obligation in an interesting way, perhaps even in an entertaining way at times, to extract information.
Well, this leads on to another reasonable question about how you assess the public intelligence. Earlier you said if you go on too long, people are bored. But do you feel that apathy and lack of interest and lack of intelligence are features in the situation?
No, I think the reason why there is apathy and a sort of despair in the political process is because the political process has been neutered, because it has been spun to the point at which PR people actually tell politicians what they can and cannot do. That surely must explain the lack of vision in politics. And we are not, I believe, the determiners of that. I think we're the victims of it. I think politics is flat in real life and flat in television because of the role of the firewall of PR people who stand between us and the politicians.
Let me come now to the question of accountability, because you've quite properly made the point that you have ministers there and powerful people and you hold them to account. And it leads me to the obvious question, who do you feel you're accountable to yourself?
I feel I'm accountable to the viewer, and the viewer can switch me off anytime they want. And I'm very mindful of that, and I don't want them to. And sometimes people write to me and say, I'll never view you again. So I write back and say, give me one more chance. And I've taken note of what you've said, and I hope to sort of try to get them to stay with us. I think we are accountable to the viewer. The viewer has the ultimate power to just switch channels, and that's the end of us. They never need to watch us again.
Jon Snow seemed preoccupied with the establishment and its top-down view of the world. You're doing it. What are you talking? He gave me the impression he believed viewers wouldn't be able to understand a complicated argument.
Iraq and Iran.